His work with other bassists helped to reimagine blues rock in the United States. He was the Texan behind the 1962 Fender Jazz and, with Stevie Ray Vaughan, brought back a style that many had written off as dead. But there's more to Tommy Shannon's life than his bass lines if you limit him to a few of albums and tours with Double Trouble. After collapsing on the road as an addict, doing construction as a result of a music ban, and recovering in treatment alongside his one and only wife, he returned to the stage not for applause, but to keep himself from falling apart. This is Tommy Shannon's story. Not only a bassist of legendary stature, but also a subtle emblem of rebirth, devotion, and music that triumphed through adversity. An unfinished tale till this moment. Thomas Lafitte Smedley, better known as Tommy Shannon, was born into a working-class American family on April 18, 1946, in Tucson, Arizona. He was the only kid in his family. His family uprooted to the little town of Dumas, Texas, when he was 9 years old, in the hopes that he would have a better life among the expansive agricultural plains. The tranquility of Dumas, away from the bustle of major cities, became the bedrock of Tommy's restrained demeanor. Major losses or obvious tragedies did not mark Tommy's youth. Even though they weren't dirt poor, his family just couldn't afford to support his artistic pursuits. While enrolled in the public schools in his area, he failed to make much of an academic impact. He had no formal musical training and never attended college. A subtle appreciation for music, meanwhile, started to germinate amid all that simplicity. Tommy, like many American teenagers in the early 1950s, was influenced by rock and roll when he first picked up the guitar. The bass, though, was the real draw for him. He had previously compared that low, steady sound to the sensation of holding things together. He began performing with his first band, the Avengers, at the tender age of 13, performing at school functions and intimate gatherings across the Texas Panhandle. Although he came from an artistic family, no one ever tried to stop him. Tommy made a living not just as a musician, but also as a construction worker, electrician, and mechanical system installer. More than just useful life skills were imparted by these events. They taught him the importance of silent labor and perseverance, principles that would serve him well throughout his career. Fame didn't come naturally to Tommy Shannon. Perhaps this is why his bass lines didn't demand recognition when they started supporting the music of Stevie Ray Vaughan and Johnny Winter. Solid, faithful, and essential, they just held everything together. Background: Tommy Shannon started performing professionally in the music industry in the early 1960s, when Texas was experiencing a musical boom with the blues and rock. He got his start playing bass in bands around Dallas and Austin, but his big break came in 1968 when he was asked to join Johnny Winter's band, the band of the era's most explosive blues guitarist. Tommy became Winter's most trusted musical companion, in contrast to numerous backup musicians. He had a key role in developing Johnny's distinctive sound on early albums like Second Winter and the progressive blues experiment with his sturdy yet flowing playing style. With Johnny Winter, Tommy swiftly gained fame and performed on legendary platforms, such as the 1969 Woodstock Festival, a moment in history that not many people know he was a part of. However, there was a shadowy side to early fame. A tragically frequent road among blues performers at the time, Shannon's spiral into drug addiction began in the 1970s. He parted ways with Johnny Winter after years of touring and recording together and began abusing drugs and alcohol. He hit a musical wall. Requests to play became increasingly rare. Now that he was out of luck at the studio, Tommy went back to Texas, where he lived quietly and made do with bricklaying and other forms of physical labor. Once upon a time, he was even ordered to attend a rehabilitation center and was placed on probation, which forbade him from performing music in public. After his time at Woodstock, Tommy Shannon was no longer allowed to play music anywhere except his house. A lot of people would have considered it the end. He persisted, nevertheless. Even though he was living in relative obscurity and poverty in the early 1980s, he persisted in practicing on his old bass, something he could do to preserve his remaining self-identity. Silent determination kept him from complete forgetfulness, and it was that very determination that brought about a tragic meeting. Tommy Shannon had already performed at Woodstock and recorded with Johnny Winter, but he didn't discover the true union of his music and soul until he met the young artist Stevie Ray Vaughan, who would go on to have a successful career. The meeting took place in 1981 in Austin, Texas, a city brimming with the vitality of a blues renaissance. Playing in local bands was a way for Shannon to make ends meet as he attempted to get his life back together after a long battle with addiction. As he entered the Soap Creek Saloon one evening, he could hear a young guitarist performing a kind of music that froze the entire establishment, as if it were being enacted by an alien presence. Steve Ray Vaughan was that guitarist. Tommy stood motionless. Despite playing with some of the greatest in the business, he had never encountered a guitarist who could evoke both the cries for aid and a confession in a single note. He requested to jam with Stevie the following day. No explanation was necessary. I only needed one session. They were both aware that they had finally discovered the one thing that musicians strive for their whole careers, an irreplaceable musical bond. The original lineup of Double Trouble, Stevie, Chris Layton on drums, and Reese Winans on keyboards, quickly dove into a creative zenith. Texas Flood, their 1983 first album, was recorded in a matter of days at Los Angeles' Jackson Browne studio and sliced through the synth-pop fog that dominated the Billboard charts like lightning. Pride and Joy rose in the charts, but it was the somber title single, Texas Flood, that revealed they weren't out to amuse, but rather to survive. Tommy was never one to seek attention. As if praying through music, he stood toward the rear of the stage and frequently played bass with his eyes closed. To keep Stevie grounded, he once said while playing, he had no idea how to control himself, so I had to tie him down. Albums followed. The weather was unbearable. In 1984, featuring singles like Tin Pan Alley and Cold Shot demonstrating they weren't a one-hit wonder. Album, Soul to Soul, 1985. Featuring elements of funk and gospel, it demonstrates the band's maturing sound. But this is when Stevie's cocaine and alcohol addictions started to spiral out of control. Looking into Stevie's blank eyes, Tommy, who had previously triumphed over his own addiction, saw a reflection of himself. They both failed in the end. Tom went to rehab. After that, Stevie followed suit. When they got back together, they weren't the same carefree band looking for a high. Two guys who were on the verge of death grabbed their instruments and played on to stay alive. The record that marked their comeback, 1989's Step, was about more than just music. It was a story of redemption. The precariousness of life and death was echoed by the tightrope. It was an honest admission on wall of denial. And the whole thing was pulsating with Tommy's deep, controlled bass. Eric Clapton's summer 1990 tour included Double Trouble. Their last performance as a band was on August 26th in Wisconsin's Alpine Valley Music Theater. Having jammed with Clapton, Buddy Guy, Jimmy Vaughan, and Robert Cray on Sweet Home Chicago for the climax, Stevie walked backstage. Overnight, there was heavy fog. Because there was only room for one person on the first helicopter, Jimmy had to give way to Stevie. That flight was not boarded by Tommy. At 1 a.m., a hillside was struck by the helicopter on August 27th. An instantaneous demise befell all 5 passengers. The bodies were identified by Jimmy Vaughan and Eric Clapton. Tommy Shannon, though, was the one who endured the vacuum for the longest. He lost more than simply a bandmate. He also lost a friend who had saved him from the depths of despair. Months passed after that fateful night, completely off limits to the public. No shows, interviews, or appearances. However, Tommy persisted in his musical pursuits. He was a founding member of the new Austin blues rock band Archangels in 1992, together with Chris Layton, Doyle Bramhall II, and Charlie Sexton. They had no intention of taking Stevie's position. They were continuing the work he had begun. Tommy was also a part of the 1994 Project Storyville, which featured members of Double Trouble as well as 2 musicians from the rock band The Subdudes. Though neither album was as commercially successful as Stevie Ray Vaughan's, critics lauded both for being genuine and in-depth. Tommy kept recording and performing in the years that followed, all the while lending his support to new musicians such as Joe Bonamassa, Susan Tedeschi, and Kenny Wayne Shepherd. He didn't have to go on a month-long tour or seek fame this time. Not to steal the show, but to keep the blues alive. He decided when to step in and do his part. On the same day as Stevie Ray Vaughan, Chris Layton, and Reese Winans were all inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 2015, he was also included. One statement constituted Tommy's entire speech. Stevie saved me from myself once, and his music is still saving people today. Well, that was it. Everyone, meet Tommy Shannon. Although he didn't stand out in any particular manner, he was the rock that kept everyone else from collapsing and, ultimately, the man who kept the Texas blues rhythm alive. Personal life. Despite the intense scrutiny that surrounded Tommy Shannon during his prime years with Double Trouble, he refrained from engaging in the kind of wild partying and transient relationships that are common in the rock industry. In 1986, he wed Kumi, a shy, timid woman who was completely cut off from the entertainment industry. The wedding was hardly a footnote in the band's conversation. On the other hand, it became Tommy's rock during those wild years. While Double Trouble was gaining fame, Tommy and Stevie were secretly falling farther and more into addiction. The use of cocaine, alcoholic beverages, and sleepless nights became the norm. It was the stage that Stevie envisioned. As Tommy stood in the dark backstage, his hands quivered from withdrawal. and he played bass in silence. However, Kumi was the one who escorted him into rehabilitation by holding his hand. They went together, not alone. They willingly entered an Austin treatment clinic in late 1986, viewing their fight against addiction as a collective rather than individual one. "I really doubt I would have made it without her," Tommy remarked at one point. "Just when I thought things couldn't get much worse, Kumi would tell me that I had overcome worse, and that the music was still on the way." Not only did they save his life, but they also saved his dignity by entering treatment together. Amid an era when numerous creatives had faded into oblivion, Tommy never relapsed after he achieved full sobriety in 1987. Together, they wrote the album In Step, which is based on the themes of healing and atonement, and he remained Stevie's constant companion during their shared rehabilitation. Still, the weather was far from over. A person named Tommy Shannon made a comeback in the news around the turn of the 2010s, this time in federal court records rather than music headlines. In New Jersey, a man who went by the same full name, Kuzo, got a 25-year prison term for dealing cocaine and heroin. Due to the similarity in name, many fans were confused and wondered if it was Tommy Shannon from Double Trouble. The man's birth year was 1976, according to official records, making him roughly 30 years younger than the accused. Still, word got around for a long time. Tommy chose to ignore the problem. Like the time after Stevie Ray Vaughan's death, he decided to be quiet in the face of it. Absent responses and explanations. His friends and family got it. No one would ever go back to giving up everything to start over. His life after 1990 was proof of that. The two friends Tommy and Kumi shared a modest ranch in the Austin, Texas area. On their property, they grew 4 Trekiner horses, cared for plants, made music, and avoided the press. There would be no social media, children, or scandals. Tommy just grinned and answered, "I don't need to tell it," when asked why he hadn't done what his contemporaries had done and written a memoir or appeared in a documentary. "There is a record of my entire life's experiences and the bass lines I've always used." Tommy Shannon chose to keep a modest profile and walk the walk in a society where artists frequently face scrutiny. From his struggles with love and addiction to his periods of silence, his life narrative is not that of a famous person, but rather of a guy who vowed to himself that he would never return from the bottom. Influence and legacy. The blues weren't invented by Tommy Shannon. Plus, he never even attempted to reinterpret it. Subtly but surely, he made sure it would remain. Despite the fact that tastes in music changed and the industry became increasingly chaotic and noisy. For more than 40 years, his bass lines were indispensable. They were never the showstopper, but rather the rock upon which the music rested. When Stevie Ray Vaughan's guitar strung Pride and Pleasure or Cold Shot, nobody can help but nod along with the bass groove. Even fewer people know that Stevie might have strayed if Tommy hadn't kept time. Throughout life and in music, he never used a complicated style of play. Tommy Shannon's bass was a model of restraint. He didn't play fast or utilize showy techniques, yet it was precisely why his playing was so effective. A number of musicians have looked up to him as an example of someone who should perform for the song and not for themselves, including Pino Palladino, Joe Dart, and Michael Rhodes. One of his legacies is the way he carried himself with grace and honor no matter what. Tommy never sought admiration, even though bass players are typically ignored in his field. However, his enduring esteem was due in large part to his humility. His younger blues contemporaries, like Joe Bonamassa, Susan Tedeschi, and Kenny Wayne Shepherd, sought him out for studio sessions not because of his fame, but because he brought a certain authenticity to their music. Many started to think about Tommy Shannon's role as Stevie Ray Vaughan's bassist, and as the person who kept Stevie grounded throughout his brief but brilliant career after his induction into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 2015, alongside members of Double Trouble and Stevie Ray. Tommy was the one who got Stevie checked into a rehabilitation center, was there for him as he got well, and helped write their last and most meaningful album, In Step. And in a world where bass is more felt than heard, Tommy Shannon's quiet recognition is the greatest legacy he leaves behind. Someone always held a tale together when it seemed like it was about to crumble. One of those people was Tommy. Here and now, Tommy Shannon, who is approaching 80 years old, is no longer performing as frequently as he did during his Double Trouble era. Nonetheless, he is still actively involved in the music industry. Contrary to popular belief, he is still a part of it, but not in the way that people expect, in the stillness and significance of individual moments. A little ranch outside of Austin, Texas, is now Tommy and Kumi's home. After waking up their 4 Trekiner horses, they have a cup of coffee on the porch while listening to the prairie grass rustle in the early wind. With no stage or microphone in sight, he continues to play music in that serene setting, not with the intention of recording or performing. as a means of maintaining his own sense of self-awareness. Tommy had a brief comeback in 2024, appearing in a handful of in-depth interviews. His most notable appearance was on In the Studio with Red Beard, when he revealed previously unknown details about the In Step album's production process. During their impromptu studio session,